Good morning, guys. Well, I feel a little silly talking into the mic at two of you, so if you guys feel like coming up, we can kind of have a conversation about this. We will go through our deck just so it gets picked up on the video, but we'll try and blast through pretty quickly so we can get to whatever questions you guys have and whatever you want to talk about. So my name is Blake Reed. I run the Tech Law and Policy Clinic at the University of Colorado Law School. And one of the issues that we spend a lot of time thinking about is the intersection of accessibility and copyright law, and how copyright law can serve as a barrier and enabler for making content, information, software, all that sort of stuff accessible. And as part of that work, we've been contracted by the World Intellectual Property Organization to study that issue on an international level. And so my students have spent the last year and a half or so conducting a study with WIPO to do that, and we're about to head off to Geneva to present that in a couple of weeks. And so this is sort of a dry run for that, but they're going to tell you a little bit about the study and the results, and we're going to try and focus specifically on the impacts of all this stuff on people with cognitive and intellectual disabilities. Turn it over to these guys.
Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Gabrielle, and I'm going to be introducing our project on international copyright law and access for people with disabilities. So let me start by laying out a framework for our discussion today. We've chosen this graphic to represent the way that the sort of unconnected areas of disability and protected works and technology end up overlapping when you start talking about transforming a work to make it accessible for someone with a disability. Before we get too deep into the substance, I'd like to talk about why copyright is an accessibility issue. So we're going to start with the example of a tactile painting to sort of lay out how this all works when you start combining protected works and technology and people with disabilities. So a tactile painting is a neat example of an accessible format for someone with a visual impairment. You take the original oil painting, here we've got Washington crossing the Delaware, and you make a copy of it, but the copy is three-dimensional. So someone can actually touch the painting and experience it that way, rather than looking at it at the wall, you can feel it. So particularly for people with visual impairments, this makes the work accessible for them in a way that it would not otherwise be. So this particular painting was created in 1851, so it's not actually covered by copyright anymore. It's too old, the copyright's expired, it's passed into the public domain. But let's pretend for a second that it was created in 1981 instead, and so it would still be protected by copyright. In that case, the creator would have certain exclusive rights that would mean that they were the only one who was allowed to do or authorize certain things like making a copy of the work. So when you have someone come along to make this accessible copy, they're implicating those exclusive rights that belong to the copyright holder. Let's try another example, this time with cognitive disabilities. So if we have a plain and simple language version of a literary work, like a book, and you're transforming that from the original text into the accessible plain and simple language version, you're making a derivative work, basically. You're taking the original text and transforming it in a way that makes it accessible, but that's also implicating the copyright of the copyright holder. So that can be copyright infringement, and because it's copyright infringement, we end up deterring the creation of accessible formats for people with disabilities. So an outline of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to start us off by talking a little bit more about the international law context for us and going over the relevant treaties for our discussion. And then I'm going to pass things off to my colleagues, Lindsay and Luke here, and they're going to tell you a little bit more about the actual work we've been doing about the member state survey and the final study that we're preparing. So the first relevant treaty is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. It's the UN treaty that moved us from a medical conception of disability to a human rights-based conception of disability. Just came up on the 10th anniversary of that, and a really important provision for our work is where the treaty explicitly recognizes that intellectual property laws like copyright can be a barrier to access. And so to the extent that the nation states are able to, they need to ensure that these laws are not serving as a barrier to cultural materials for persons with disabilities. The other relevant treaty for our discussion is the Marrakesh Treaty to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled. This is a more recent treaty that was negotiated by the member states of the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. And the goal of the treaty is to increase access to print materials like books for people with print disabilities. So the treaty is limited in what it covers. Even though it's been widely heralded as this really successful international instrument, increasing access for people with disabilities around the world, the actual coverage is pretty narrow. What it really covers is people with a visual or a physical disability that keeps them from accessing a published print work. But the treaty did start out much wider in scope. So it originally covered other mediums like audiovisual materials, auditory materials, your sort of traditional pictorial, graphical, sculptural works. These other types of media were covered in the scope, as well as other disabilities like oral disabilities and cognitive disabilities. But during the negotiating process of the treaty, the scope got narrower and narrower until we are left with print disabilities for people with visual impairments. But after the treaty was signed, we have the members of the SCCR, which is the subcommittee of WIPO that's responsible for copyright issues, coming together and expressing that they still want to have conversations about this. They want to keep talking about policy at an international level for people with disabilities and things that aren't covered on the Marrakesh Treaty. So in 2015, they actually requested an academic study for things that aren't covered under the scope of Marrakesh so they could keep having these conversations. I'm going to pass things over to Lindsay now, and she'll talk a little more in detail about the member state survey and the work that we've been doing.
Hi, everyone. So it was in the fall of 2016 that our clinic became involved with this project. In the initial stage, we began by drafting a survey because we wanted to figure out what member states' laws currently look like and to figure out whether they had exceptions and limitations that applied to people with disabilities to access protected works. We then, our group, got involved in the beginning of 2017, and we took over the survey and we finalized that, and we were able to send that out to all of the member states of WIPO. We also took that spring, to meet with various disability rights advocates, both here in Colorado and also in Washington, D.C. And the goal of those meetings were for us to better understand where copyright has become a barrier for people with disabilities. And we wanted to talk to them about the future and where they foresaw problems, especially as technology changes and as we interact with protected works in new and different ways. As we mentioned earlier, we're actually returning to Geneva to present the findings of the survey because that went out in April. We received responses throughout the summer, and we've been compiling those. So we'll present that the 13th through the 17th in Geneva. And we're hoping to continue the discussions with member states about the need for something else so that people aren't limited in access to various content. So like we said, we sent out the survey. And the survey, it sought to understand what the laws were in the member states around the world. And we specifically wanted to look at the exceptions and limitations that enabled access for people with disabilities to protected works. So the responses, they provided the substance, a lot of the substance to our report that we will be presenting next week. So to better understand the responses in the report, WIPO itself consists of 191 member states. And we were able to send the survey to all of them. It was interesting to us because when we went to the meeting, we learned quickly that not all member states participate as actively as others, and there are more, I guess there are some that are just a bit more active and play a more critical role in shaping the treaties and the soft law that comes from these meetings. So the responses we received were from 23 different members, and they spanned 5 different continents, and they provided us a glimpse at what other national copyright and disability laws look like around the world. When it came to actually preparing our study, we decided to focus on a qualitative response and analysis just because we did have 23 member states that responded, so it wasn't enough to really draw conclusions about how the majority of member states address disability law and copyright or how the minority do, but instead we were able to give snapshots of how these countries have addressed the problems. So as we kind of expected, countries address this in different ways. There's not a single method in which they have adopted laws, or there's not a single model code in which they've adopted in their countries. So a lot of the member states do have a national law that does provide for people with disabilities to take certain acts to make that copyrighted material accessible to them. But it's important to recognize that not all member states do. So not every person in every country is able to make an act or to transform a work to make it accessible for them. We also learned that this seems to be an important time because a lot of member states after Marrakesh are rethinking what their national laws look like. So they've indicated that there's some willingness to amend national laws to adopt and implement some of the recommendations that WIPO might provide them. So as Gabrielle mentioned, we looked at the disabilities and how the member states define them. We looked at protected works and how member states define those. And we also looked at technology to figure out what their national laws, how broad or how narrow the national laws were. So to begin, we started with disabilities. We asked countries whether the laws related to copyright exceptions and limitations were defined narrowly, or whether they allowed access for people with any disability. So when countries did define their laws more narrowly and limited the limitations and the exceptions for people with disabilities, they narrowed them to oral disabilities or visual disabilities or cognitive or physical. But there were countries that broadly defined what a disability was to say any disability, or a person with any disability can transform the work to make it accessible. We then asked about protected works and how they defined those categories. So we wanted to know, again, whether they were narrowly defined or whether they took a broader approach. And when they did narrowly define the categories of protected works, whether they're books or news articles or movies, they typically fit into categories of visual works, print works, audio works, or audiovisual works. So I'm going to turn it over to Luke so that he can talk to you about the technologies and how those are implicated in addressing accessibility.
All right, thanks, Lindsay. So yeah, the final part of our paper outlines a number of existing and new technologies that aren't currently covered by Marrakesh to sort of give them an idea of some of the existing barriers that weren't really solved by Marrakesh. Some of the ones we outline are screen readers, refreshable braille displays, closed captioning, and audio or video description. So a screen reader can implicate copyright by converting visual items on a web page into an oral format. This could be considered a transformation or a translation, which would, under copyright law, require permission from the original creator. Refreshable braille displays convert printed text into braille, which could be construed as a translation, also requiring authorization. Closed captioning is the same way, except it converts oral media into visual format. And then audio-video description describes visual media in an oral format, which could also be construed as a transformation or a translation. Then we go on to explain that there are some new technologies that, while they're not fully developed yet, might need copyright to get out of the way so that they can develop. This includes virtual reality / augmented reality and machine learning. So augmented reality can be used in concert with an item like Google Glass, where it's transmitting a visual image across the web to a translator, which then describes the visual media to the user. This can be automated by machine learning as well, but the current technology requires a person to be doing the translating. And right now, in the current state of copyright, this would require authorization from anybody who owns a sculpture or architecture or a painting that's being described. So I mentioned how machine learning can make that faster. Machine learning can also be very useful in making works into plain and simple language, and copyright could be a barrier to that as well. So we go on to describe a few of the possible approaches that member states can be making to get copyright out of the way. We can do fair use, which is the way the United States has been going, which pretty much allows any sort of good faith transformation or translation. Other countries like the UK take a fair dealing approach, which generally allows translations and transformations for good faith purposes, but it enumerates the specific reasons, like for education or accessibility. And then you could even narrow the scope even further by essentially doing what the Marrakesh Treaty did by saying just for print disabilities and just for printed works. In addition to the law, you can create motivations within the industry, either motivated parties who would like to transform the works or the creators. And you can range the level of motivation by simply allowing them to have an exception in copyright, or you could require them to make technologies accessible. All of these come with varying political balancing acts, of course. Finally, we are hoping to get more member state responses so we can get a better image of how everything looks on the international stage. We're going to urge that the conversation keep happening so that we can address a broader range of disabilities and a broader range of protected works. We might even propose a non-binding resolution. There's not much appetite for a hard treaty yet. So we're thinking of working with soft law. And I think that's about it. So we welcome your questions.
I hope you guys have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
I was asked to make sure that we're out of here by 5 of.
Okay.
I think we'll do all right with that. What do you guys want to chat about?
Since it's not an area that I have any knowledge of, could you give us, a couple of examples of where there's been actual infringement on copyright that is where there have been suits brought when the purpose was, fair or I'm not thinking of what examples.
So there's two examples I'll throw at you to think about. One is with foreign language translations, right? So movie studios, for example, care a lot about the ability to control when a movie that is made in English gets translated into Spanish, French, Russian, Arabic, and so forth, because they use this windowing strategy to release the movie all over the world. And so if somebody makes a translation of a movie, they're really concerned about it. So lawsuits all the time over unauthorized translations. Well, it turns out from a technical perspective, translations look pretty close to the process of making closed captions, right? So you make closed captions or you make subtitles for a movie. It's not that far of a jump prompt to make translations of it. So for example, you'll see copyright owners getting very nervous about people making closed captions because they're worried that's going to be a slippery slope down the road to translation. So that's one example. Another example that comes to mind, if you've heard of have you guys heard of Google Books? You guys a little bit familiar with that? So Google goes into these libraries and basically scans in the entire corpus of books in a library using these very complicated machines. And then they're basically available digitally. And there's all kinds of cool stuff that happens with, so it's the educational part of the Google Books sort of enterprise called HathiTrust. And at all of HathiTrust member university libraries, you can do things like search the entire corpus. So you can do like a Google search on all the books in the library. Pretty cool. You can do things like digital lending. All right, that starts making copyright holders nervous. They like selling books. They get a little antsy about lending things. You can also do things like make the books accessible to people with visual disabilities. So you could automatically, so libraries are obliged under the ADA to serve patrons with disabilities, or at least university libraries generally are. And so they say, gosh, this would save us a tremendous amount of time to be able to automatically generate, whether it's Braille versions, large print versions, or other alternate formats. And we can use the HathiTrust corpus to do that. And so the Authors Guild, big organization representing authors, actually came in and sued HathiTrust and sued Google over this whole thing and said, you guys are scanning in millions of books. We should be making money off of this. You're infringing our copyright. And so all of these accessibility issues that the university libraries were also trying to address got sort of swept into that. So we actually have a case out of the Second Circuit where the court is dealing with both those kind of commercial exploitation issues and accessibility issues all at once. So those are just a couple of examples of how this kind of thing can come up. I don't know if that is responsive. Is that helpful?
Yeah, so a movie in English, closed captioned in English, so that people with oral disabilities could view and enjoy that movie. That would result in lawsuits.
Yeah, so a couple of ways that this can come up. So fairly unlikely that someone is going to sue just over that. But I'll give you an example of our lawsuit is going to come up with closed captions. So it turns out that people don't just use closed captions to serve people who are deaf or hard of hearing. So the accessibility purpose is pretty uncontroversial. But if you've ever watched a show like used to watch The Daily Show or The Stephen Colbert Show or any of those nightly shows that make use of a lot of video clips for comedy. So how do they do that? They have these large racks of digital video recorders that record every channel all day. They record CNN and Fox and everything, and they do all that stuff. How do they search all those hours of videos? They search the closed captions, right? And so the copyright holders get upset about that technology and say, hey, you're using this to basically avoid paying us for some kind of commercial service where we would offer you clips or something like that. So a lot of times we see these external uses of closed captions. Another way is search optimization, for example. So it turns out it's really hard to search videos on YouTube because how do you search a video? Well, one really good way to do it is look at the closed captions. That tells you what everybody is saying in the video. So there's a lot of money to be made once closed captions get added for accessibility purposes. And so that's one way we see it come up. One other way we see it come up is where somebody is hit with an obligation to do closed captions or video description or to make plain and simple language versions of a book or whatever it might be under some disability law. And they say, you know what, I might get sued for copyright infringement for making that transformation. I might be implicating copyright law, so don't make me comply with accessibility law. So we actually see it come up in ADA and FCC legal actions all the time, where someone who is charged with complying with a disability law says, don't make us comply with the disability law because we don't want to violate anybody's copyright. So that's another way this comes up. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk about how changes to the web, particularly like digital rights management and net neutrality issues, could affect sort of accessibility, especially if you're trying to translate things and people are calling in what is it, Digital Millennium Copyright Acts to shut down all sorts of things. Sort of where that's going.
Yeah, all right, so lots of issues here. Jump in if you guys want to pick any of these things up. So another thing that we're actually working on in the clinic right now is disability services offices at universities are often charged with making video accessible or making electronic books accessible. And it turns out that a lot of so a professor will assign a video to be watched in class or assign people to use some kind of electronic reading. And a lot of this stuff has digital rights management attached to it. And oftentimes the only way to make something accessible is to strip the digital rights management off. And so DRM is something that's used to avoid piracy, right? It prevents you from making unauthorized copies and that sort of thing. But it can also inhibit the ability to transform, for example, a book into an audio version, or to add closed captions to a video, or to take a book and make a plain and simple language version or whatever the accessibility measure might be. And so disability services offices would like to be able to basically crack the DRM, take the DRM off for educational purposes. And that's illegal under, or can be illegal under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And so one of the things we're working on is an exemption at the U.S. Copyright Office to allow Disability Services Office to do that without worrying about liability under the DMCA. All right, that was one half of your question. Net neutrality?
Well, I guess just that the DMCA was the big part of it, but yeah, just on the web itself and how accessible or inaccessible the web is, and if there's trends or where we're going on the internet.
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things I'll say about that. One is, at least with websites, if you're just talking about the World Wide Web, so web pages, the technology and the standards to develop accessible web pages, and I think there are a number of sessions here today about the kind of mechanics of how to do that, are pretty well developed. It takes some planning and some foresight and some attention to detail on the front end of creating a website to do that, right? It's pretty easy to do a website the wrong way, just as easy to do a website the right way. So a lot of the efforts on making websites accessible are dedicated at, for example, procurement. So when you hire a website vendor, make sure that you build into the contract that they're going to comply with the WCAG guidelines or WCAG guidelines. Another big part of it, and we're doing some work on this, is making sure for people who are developing their own websites that they are able to get tools that make accessibility kind of the default, right? So if you're using something like Dreamweaver, or using a platform like Squarespace or something like that, working with the developers of those tools to make sure they build accessibility features in and sort of nudge people making their own websites to make things accessible. So we're thinking a lot about that. How do you make platforms and tools nudge people towards the default of accessibility and who might not have otherwise thought about accessibility? So that's kind of one piece of the web. I guess one other thing to mention, since you mentioned net neutrality, can't resist talking about that for a second. Have you guys all heard of net neutrality? So basic idea is we don't have paid prioritization. We don't have blocking. We don't. We let traffic flow over the internet, kind of regardless of what it is or where it's coming from. And then one thing that's come up around that with accessibility is there have been some internet service. Whoops, my watch is yelling at me. One thing that's come up around that is internet service providers have said, "Oh, we'd actually like to be able to do." Prioritize disabilities applications. So we want things to run with really low latency, for example. So the example that Luke talked about, where somebody's wearing Google glasses around and beaming all the images back to a data center or a call center, where either a computer or a person is sitting there saying, well, what are you seeing in your environment, and then speaking it back to them. So that doesn't work very well if you got a 10-second delay, right? You want it to be happening kind of in real time. And so one question is, do we need to alter how networks work to accommodate that better? And the answer that we've taken, and I work with a lot of deaf and hard of hearing groups on this, is that it's actually not usually necessary to do much in the way of prioritization. Today's networks are usually actually pretty good without prioritization at accommodating those kind of applications. We tend to have plenty of bandwidth to make that work. And so the disability groups have generally been supportive of net neutrality. But there are some really cutting edge applications where they say, we want to have the tactile internet. I think one of the keynotes today is sort of about that, where we want to transmit extremely low latency, lots and lots of data. So this is kind of a conversation that's happening among people that are developing that technology, network architects, to try to figure out what kind of network management you need to make that happen. And so stay tuned. That technology is still kind of coming together, and we haven't seen how it's going to shake out yet. Is that responsive?
Yeah, I mean, just if I could, as far as like the DMCA and like, you know, I've heard all sorts of stories of just like how indiscriminate those takedown notices can be. Is there, I guess, like any effort, any thought, you know, trying to protect these kind of accessible works from those kind of things, those kind of notices?
So let me make sure I understand your question right. So there's actually two parts of the DMCA. The one I was talking about before is the anti-circumvention measures. You can't break digital locks. There's another part of the DMCA you may have heard of. It's called Section 512, and it's notice and takedown. So if somebody posts somebody else's copyrighted video to YouTube, or post it to Reddit, or post it to any site, the copyright holder can send a takedown notice to that platform, can send a takedown notice to YouTube and say, hey, that's infringing, take it down. And the platform has to respond very quickly and take the video down, and then there's this whole process, so you can go back and forth, and the user can say, no, put it back up, and they can fight about it. So I guess your question is if there are indiscriminate takedowns. And
not necessarily indiscriminate, but just is there an effort to, I guess, figure out, like, you know, this shouldn't be taken down because it's accessible and it's protected, or is that an issue?
You want to take that one, Gabrielle?
Part of the issue, if we're talking about YouTube, which is where a lot of the discussion about this has been going on recently, is that it's not always humans or humans with legal training who are making these decisions. So in terms of some like interesting related but different case law, there was the case about a baby dancing to like a Prince song that was playing in the background, right? And that famously got taken down, and they were saying, no, this is fair use. It's, you know, it's a baby dancing. I'm not uploading Prince's songs so that people can enjoy it. And that went up to the Ninth Circuit, and the court was taking a look at, like, to what extent do you have to have a good faith belief that the thing is actually infringement and not fair use before you take it down. So it's certainly something that's being discussed, not so much in the disability context specifically, but as part of this wider conversation we're having about how takedowns are working in the context of fair use. And as Luke mentioned, accessibility is one area that is a fair use.
Yeah, and generally the accessibility features are sort of tied into other issues, right? So it's like here's a classic example, and this happens a lot. Somebody that takes a video that's on YouTube that doesn't have closed captions, downloads the video, adds captions to it, and then re-uploads the video, right? So we've got one thing that's okay, which is adding captions to the video, and then we got one thing that's a little more questionable, which is uploading a new copy of the video, right? So all those questions get kind of intertwined together, which is like, yeah, you made the video accessible, but now you're also taking ad revenue from the poster of the original video. And so sorting those sorts of disputes out is a pretty complicated problem. And one of the ways we're thinking about addressing that is working with people like YouTube to allow people to add captions to videos or allow people to add video descriptions to videos. And you can imagine other sorts of, if you wanted to work with an ebook publisher to make plain and simple language versions of something available. So a lot of it is collaboration with publishers and distribution platforms and that sort of thing. But these are hard issues that we're thinking about. Yeah.
So give us some examples of language or strategies that you're going to propose in these, you said you're going to propose not treaties, but agreements. That, how do you go about the process of wording something so that it gives a lot of permissions for accessibility for disability reasons and doesn't infringe on the copyright from issues that result in revenue?
I think it might actually be a little easier to word the kind of exceptions we're looking for because we don't have to limit the types of disabilities or the types of works. We aren't going to be proposing any specific wording because that's our place is kind of as researchers, according to WIPO. So, but you could have just a wording that says the member states recognize that it's important to allow copyright exceptions for any protected work as long as the transformation is being made for any disability. That's just off the top of my head, though.
One other thing that I think is important to remember is the sort of sophistication around the world around these issues of content accessibility, right? And so I think it's easy to get caught in terms of what we're doing in the United States, and especially at a conference like this where we're talking about bleeding edge issues of cognitive and intellectual disabilities and how to go about addressing those. Around the world, that is not where things are. There are countries. So one of the questions that we asked was to describe a little bit about your national disability laws in addition to your national copyright laws. Tell us what you require in terms of disabilities. And there are a lot of countries that basically don't have anything on that front. So part of what we were trying to do with this conversation is not just to drive home specific language. And there's some really thorny issues that we're grappling with here in the U.S. in terms of we got these commercial purposes and accessibility purposes, and they're intertwined together in this really complicated way. But there are places around the world where there's accessibility is just on the back burner. Nobody is really thinking about it in a careful way. So one of the things we're trying to do with this study is to develop some capacity, to develop some understanding, to foster some discussion among countries around the world about these issues in general, right? So to have folks in the copyright industries be thinking, oh, geez, this is going to become a major part of our economy in a developing country. We're going to start having creative outputs. We're going to start having a software industry. We're going to start having a movie industry. We're going to start having music and all of that kind of stuff. And thinking about how can we proactively address disability issues? And I think at the end of the day, we would look at this and say, you actually don't necessarily need copyright exceptions and limitations if copyright holders are taking a really proactive approach to accessibility. So, if every book publisher puts out an audiobook version of their book or puts it into a tool that creates plain and simple language versions, or every creator of a TV show or a movie puts captions and video description on it in the first place, and we actually don't have a lot to talk about in terms of copyright. So that's part of what we're trying to do as well, is just get countries to think about accessibility of information and content in a more general sense. And in a lot of places, these hard questions about how do you balance the commercial interests versus how do you balance accessibility and all of that kind of stuff, those are years away. So we're trying to kind of get people down the road. Yeah.
So I'm starting to feel a little awkward because I'm the only person who hasn't spoken.
Do it.
So I don't really have a question, and actually what you just said was something that I've been thinking about a lot of, so you've answered the only question I might have had. I actually wear a couple of hats. I'm an IT guy at an organization that supports people with disabilities. We have about 150 clients in Wyoming.
Cool.
And I'm also a filmmaker and a writer.
Yeah.
So it's very important to me that my clients, or our clients, have access to art and creativity. So I just want to say thank you for what you're doing.
Well, and thank you for being a filmmaker and an author and for being at a conference like this. And I think that's the long-term goal of all of this work we're doing. Copyright is kind of a vehicle for fostering discussions among creators and distributors of copyrighted works to think about how their works get experienced by these big portions of their potential audience, or maybe don't get experienced at all because they don't think about accessibility and they don't think, well,
People that I work with
yeah.
have the same access to people that I do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And some of the conversations, so we're going to be doing a roundtable in a couple of weeks with lots of authors and folks from the film industry. And one of the questions is, for example, for the directors of the world, or the filmmakers of the world, how much money do you spend on costumes? How much do you spend on cinematography? How much do you spend on every little detail of a movie? And then you don't think about spending a couple $100 to add really good closed captions, or probably a couple of $1,000, or spend a little bit more than that to add really good video descriptions, or to think about how that's going to be a part of the experience for a huge part of your audience, right? And so that's part of what we're trying to do, is to say, you should care about this not just because there's some legal obligation or whatever, but you should think about this and care about this as an artist. And so that's part of what we're trying to do, and engaging on these copyright issues is talk to the creative community and say, hey, you guys should care about this based on your own sort of internal principles. I appreciate the comment. Well, maybe we should wrap. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. This was fun.